Did you know there are some people who compare elective abortion to the Holocaust? You can find them quite easily on the internet, and if you live in the United States, particularly the southern states, you can probably meet them in person. I'm not kidding, they're out there. I was once having a lively discussion on this topic with my own mother. At one point she said, "Well, how does that make you any better than Hitler?" And I was just amazed, because all of a sudden I am now less than or equal to Hitler. How did that happen? Of course, these people are probably not representative of the entire anti-abortion movement. They're just representative of people who compare things to the Holocaust, which is almost always a bad idea, because there are very few things that actually are comparable to the Holocaust. So they're probably going to get it wrong. Not only are they going to get it wrong, they are going to offend people, because people are sensitive about things like the Holocaust. Of course, they probably know this, and they do it just to get attention, which isn't really the best strategy, because it's hard to get people to actually listen to you and consider what you're saying when you've just said something completely outrageous and crazy. And the crazy thing here is these people seem to think the life of a Jewish, Polish, gay, or disabled person is somehow equal to an unborn fetus or embryo, which is really so bizarre that it's worth examining why they would say something like that. You see, many people object to abortion for religious reasons. This is not limited to people who compare abortion to the Holocaust. Many religions, specifically Christianity, which is predominant in the U.S., believe that every human is endowed with a soul. Although the precise details of what a soul is and does vary between religions, the soul is usually considered to be an immaterial component of a person's mind that contains their consciousness and survives after the body dies. Now, if you don't believe that souls or other supernatural things exist, then it's obvious that consciousness is entirely dependent upon the physical brain. The idea of something being conscious before it even has a brain is incoherent, as is the idea of consciousness surviving after the brain dies. But many religious people believe a person has a soul from the very moment sperm meets egg and forms a zygote. From that point on, it has a soul. And this is the basis for saying that a Jewish person is somehow equal to a fetus, an embryo, or even a single cell. Each of them allegedly has a soul, and in these religions that is the critical defining feature of a person. And there really are anti-abortion websites that describe a zygote as, quote, a single-celled human being. Just take a moment to think about that. Single cell, human being, single cell. The two are clearly not equal. If I scratch myself, how many human beings are hiding under my fingernails? Now, this is where physicalism as a philosophy really helps to clarify these issues. We know that the physical world exists. We don't know that immaterial things like souls exist. That's just a proposal with no evidence in its favor, and it makes no sense to assume that things like souls do exist. And from a physical perspective, a fetus that hasn't yet developed the structures of the brain necessary for consciousness and perception, which happens near the end of the second trimester, is not equal to a fully developed conscious human being. This is obvious. Using unproven concepts like the soul to try and claim otherwise leads to ridiculous conclusions like a single cell being somehow equal to a whole person. Unfortunately, these beliefs are quite common in the U.S., and people do follow their beliefs even when they lead to these strange conclusions. As a result, we have refused to provide federal funding for any stem cell research that would use human embryos. President Bush vetoed 2 bills that would have funded this research. He did so based on the invalid moral objections mentioned earlier. He spoke of violating human life and the destruction of human life. He said, "I will not allow our nation to cross this moral line." He said, "Destroying human life in the hopes of saving human life is not ethical," as if the two were equal. What many people aren't aware of is that if these bills were not vetoed, the human embryos used for research would have come from fertility clinics, that is, facilities that perform in vitro fertilization, where couples who can't conceive in the usual fashion have their sperm and eggs manually combined into zygotes. These are then observed in the early stages of embryonic development when they have between 1 and 100 cells. The embryos of the highest quality are implanted into the woman's womb, but that means not all of them are implanted. Some embryos are not used. They're left over and kept in cold storage in case they're needed later. These frozen embryos can be successfully revived and implanted, even after they've been frozen for 9 years. Even if the embryo has lost half of its cells during the freezing and thawing, it can still develop into a healthy pregnancy. Now, tell me, can you freeze a Jewish person for 9 years and revive them? Can a Jewish person survive if you kill half of their cells? And yet a fully grown person is supposedly equal to an embryo. It gets even better. These fertility clinics have a limited capacity for storing embryos. At some point, unused embryos must be discarded. This is done by incinerating the embryos, flushing them down a drain, or just leaving them out until they die. And those embryos that are thrown away are the ones that would have been used for stem cell research. But people prefer that these embryos be destroyed instead of using them for scientific research that could develop new treatments. Treatments for people who actually are people, not just clumps of a dozen cells. Treatments for people who are suffering, not single cells that are incapable of experiencing anything resembling suffering. They are impeding the progress of science in the name of a grotesque ethic that says the so-called sanctity of these cells is more important than helping real people who are ill. Yet, despite how important these cells are, they have no problem with just destroying them. They think these cells are the equivalent of living, breathing people like you and me, and yet they'd rather kill them than allow them to be used to help people. I cannot even believe some of the stupid things that go on in this world, but this takes the cake. If you're looking to compare something to the Holocaust, why not check out the nearest fertility clinic? After all, you'd be pretty upset if they were incinerating Jews, right? Remember, these are single-celled human beings. You know, I think we can take this Holocaust thing even further. If you have a working uterus, then you could be the next Schindler, because some of these embryos are available to be donated to anyone. You could just walk right into the fertility clinic and rescue an embryo or two. If you can afford it, of course. But remember, these are human beings we're talking about. They're going to die if you don't do something about it. You see, if you're going to pretend that single cells have just as much worth as any fully grown person, and if you're going to use this to justify impeding medical research that could actually help people, then you should acknowledge all of the conclusions that follow from this premise, and you should act accordingly and consistently. Otherwise, you are a spiteful and dishonest person who really has no concern for human life and the well-being of your fellow man. And how does that make you any better than Hitler?